What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com. Here are my DFS picks for NBA Wednesday, March 24th. These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button and hit that bell icon so you don't miss our new videos. In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for today's NBA slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, we have an 11-game slate tonight, so let's take a look at the point guard position. Now I'm not going to go over this player, but I just want to point him out. He's coming off of a bad game, only scored 46 fantasy points in 29 minutes last game. And yes, that is a bad game for Luka Doncic from the Dallas Mavericks playing the Minnesota Timberwolves, who have the second worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing point guards. Vegas thinks there's going to be 230 points scored in this game, so I think it's a nice bounce back game for the stud Luka Doncic. So I like Luka here versus the Minnesota Timberwolves. So that's kind of an obvious pick there. Another stud who's not as pricey and he's got big upside. I like Trae Young from the Atlanta Hawks playing the Sacramento Kings, who have the second worst defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing point guards. Trae Young has averaged 43.6 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 34 minutes per game with a 33% usage rate. He scored 45, 35, and 42 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 37, 33, and 25 minutes. He's projected at 41.6 fantasy points here tonight, but I think he can get you 44 fantasy points and get you 5 times value or more. He's $8,700 FanDuel salary and the same price on DraftKings. So I like that price on both sites. Now Vegas thinks there's going to be 236.5 points scored in this game. So I like Trae Young here versus the Sacramento Kings. Okay, now I just noticed a play that I like on DraftKings. I like Jrue Holiday from the Milwaukee Bucks playing the Boston Celtics, who have a good defense overall, and they've been middle of the pack defending opposing point guards. Jrue Holiday has averaged 34.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 31 minutes per game with a 21% usage rate. He scored 62, 34, and 40 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 29, 34, and 40 minutes. He's projected at 35.8 fantasy points here tonight. Now on FanDuel, that's only 4.3 times value because he's $8,300 FanDuel salary, but he's $1,100 less on DraftKings. So I love that DraftKings price. So he should get you 5 times value or more on DraftKings if he scores 35 fantasy points. And he scored 43, 38, 22, and 35 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Celtics. So he would have got you 5 times value or more on DraftKings, 3 out of his last 4 games versus the Celtics. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 230 points scored in this game. So I like Jrue Holiday on DraftKings here versus the Boston Celtics. Okay, another point guard that I like is Chris Paul from the Phoenix Suns playing the Orlando Magic, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing point guards. Chris Paul has averaged 37.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 32 minutes per game with a 22% usage rate. He scored 28, 53, and 32 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 27, 32, and 33 minutes. He's projected at 36.5 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.9 times value. He's $7,500 FanDuel salary and $200 more on DraftKings. So this is a back-to-back for Chris Paul, but he only played 27 minutes last game, and he scored 37, 38, 40, and 33 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Magic. Vegas thinks there's going to be 214.5 points scored in this game. It's a great matchup, so I like Chris Paul here versus the Orlando Magic. Okay, another point guard that I like is Kemba Walker from the Boston Celtics playing the Milwaukee Bucks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and although they've been pretty good versus opposing point guards, Kemba Walker has averaged 30.9 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 30 minutes per game with a 27% usage rate. He scored 31 and 28 fantasy points in the last 2 games, playing 31 and 36 minutes. So he's coming off of a game of rest, so he's rested and ready to go. Projected at 32.6 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.2 times value. He's 6,300 FanDuel salary and 200 more on DraftKings. He scored 22, 59, 45, and 35 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Bucks. So that's really good player versus team history. He would have got you way over 5 times value, and in 3 of the last 4 games versus the Bucks. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 230 points scored in this game, so a high-scoring game. So I like Kemba Walker here versus the Milwaukee Bucks. Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching. If you want to enter the drawing for $100 PayPal, all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won, and then we'll send you $100 PayPal. So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you. Okay, let's take a look at the shooting guard position. Now I have a FanDuel play for you. I like Marcus Smart from the Boston Celtics playing the Milwaukee Bucks. Now Marcus Smart has averaged 28.6 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 31 minutes per game with a 19% usage rate. He scored 31, 28, and 27 fantasy points in his last 3 games, playing 39, 32, and 33 minutes. He's projected at 28.7 fantasy points here tonight. On FanDuel, that's 5.7 times value. He's only 5,000 FanDuel salary, so he only needs 25 fantasy points to get you 5 times value or more on FanDuel. Now he is 900 more on DraftKings, but I love that FanDuel price. Even with Kemba Walker back, he should still be playing 30 minutes or more and have a great chance to crush value on FanDuel. And he scored 19, 28, 40, 36, and 16 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Bucks. So 5 times value or more, 3 out of those last 5 games. So I like Marcus Smart here versus the Milwaukee Bucks. Okay, another shooting guard that I like. Now, this is another FanDuel play. I like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander from the Oklahoma City Thunder playing the Memphis Grizzlies, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander has averaged 39.5 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 34 minutes per game with a 29% usage rate. He scored 48 and 27 fantasy points in the last 2 games, playing 34 and 30 minutes. He's projected at 38.4 fantasy points here tonight, and on FanDuel, that's 5.5 times value. He's only 7,000 FanDuel salary, but he's 1,300 more on DraftKings, so I love that FanDuel price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 221.5 points scored in this game, and he scored 37, 34, 18, 34, and 43 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Grizzlies. So I like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander on FanDuel here versus the Memphis Grizzlies. Okay, now here's a play that I like on both sites. This is a value play for you. I like PJ Dozier from the Denver Nuggets playing the Toronto Raptors, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. PJ Dozier, he's only averaged 16.9 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 20 minutes per game with a 17% usage rate, but he scored 24, 17, and 8 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 27, 22, and 17 minutes. He's projected at 18.1 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.2 times value. He's only 3,500 FanDuel salary, and he's 100 less on DraftKings. And he scored 43 fantasy points in his last game versus the Raptors. Vegas thinks there's going to be 224 points scored in this game. It's a good matchup. So I like PJ Dozier as a high-risk, high-reward tournament play here versus the Toronto Raptors. Okay, who do we have at the small forward position? I like Harrison Barnes from the Sacramento Kings playing the Atlanta Hawks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 13th most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. Harrison Barnes has averaged 30.8 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 36 minutes per game with a 17% usage rate. He scored 30, 30, and 33 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 41, 32, and 38 minutes. He's projected at 31.2 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.2 times value. He's 6,000 FanDuel salary and 500 more on DraftKings. He scored 24, 33, 32, and 31 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Hawks. And we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 236.5 points scored in this game. So I like that high-scoring game. So I like Harrison Barnes here versus the Atlanta Hawks. Okay, now a stud for you at the small forward position. I like Kawhi Leonard from the LA Clippers playing the San Antonio Spurs, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing small forwards. Kawhi Leonard has averaged 45.5 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 34 minutes per game with a 30% usage rate. He scored 48, 39, and 43 fantasy points in his last 3 games, playing 33, 31, and 36 minutes. He's projected at 45.4 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.8 times value. He's 9,500 FanDuel salary, and he's 500 less on DraftKings. So I like that DraftKings price. And he scored 58, 46, 58, 44, and 62 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Spurs. So excellent player versus team history. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 220 points scored in this game. So I like Kawhi Leonard here versus the San Antonio Spurs. Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups. Okay, who do we have at the power forward position? I'm going to give you a value play here. So I have 2 value plays for you on FanDuel, then I'll give you a DraftKings pick. So I like Jay Crowder from the Phoenix Suns playing the Orlando Magic, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing power forwards. Jay Crowder has averaged 21.6 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 28 minutes per game with a 16% usage rate. he scored 24, 26, and 19 fantasy points in his last 3 games, playing 26, 30, and 28 minutes. He's projected at 22.3 fantasy points here tonight, and on FanDuel, that's 5.7 times value. He's $3,900 FanDuel salary, but he's $700 more on DraftKings. So I like that FanDuel price. He scored 31, 22, 20, 14, and 23 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Magic. Vegas thinks there's going to be 214.5 points scored in this game. So I like Jay Crowder as a value play on FanDuel here versus the Orlando Magic. Okay, another value play on FanDuel. I like Maxi Kleber from the Dallas Mavericks playing the Minnesota Timberwolves, who have the 2nd worst defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Maxi Kleber has averaged 19.6 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 28 minutes per game with a 10% usage rate. He scored 21, 30, and 18 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 25, 34, and 40 minutes. He's projected at 21.7 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.7 times value on FanDuel because he's only $3,800 FanDuel salary, but he's $1,100 more on DraftKings. So this is a FanDuel only play for me. And he scored 9, 27, 16, 24, and 22 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Timberwolves. It's a great matchup, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 230 points scored in this game. So I like Maxi Kleber as a value play on FanDuel here versus the Minnesota Timberwolves. Okay, now a DraftKings play for you. I like Nicholas Claxton from the Brooklyn Nets playing the Utah Jazz, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing power forwards, but Nicholas Claxton has averaged 22.7 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 18 minutes per game with a 19% usage rate. He scored 29, 30, and 21 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 21, 26, and 22 minutes. He's projected at 25.1 fantasy points here tonight, and even on FanDuel, that's 5 times value. He's $5,000 FanDuel salary, but he's $1,000 less on DraftKings. So I love that DraftKings price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 233.5 points scored in this game, so I like Nicholas Claxton, especially on DraftKings, here versus the Utah Jazz. Okay, moving on to the center position. I like Rudy Gobert from the Utah Jazz playing the Brooklyn Nets, who have the 13th worst defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing centers. Rudy Gobert has averaged 41.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 31 minutes per game with an 18% usage rate. He scored 63, 40, and 38 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 33, 35, and 33 minutes. He's projected at 43.1 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.2 times value. He's $8,300 FanDuel salary and $100 more on DraftKings. So he scored 34, 59, 49, 52, and 61 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Nets. Excellent player versus team history. It's a great matchup. So I like Rudy Gobert here versus the Brooklyn Nets. The other center that I like is Clint Capella from the Atlanta Hawks playing the Sacramento Kings, who have the 2nd worst defense overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing centers. Clint Capella has averaged 40.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 29 minutes per game with a 20% usage rate. He scored 32, 36, and 25 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 29, 22, and 25 minutes. He's projected at 37.8 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.2 times value. He's 7,200 FanDuel salary and 100 more on DraftKings. Now he scored 47, 38, 31, 30, and 49 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Kings. It's a fantastic matchup, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 236.5 points scored in this game, so you got a high-scoring game. So I like Clint Capella here versus the Sacramento Kings. If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.